Thank you very much, everyone. What I'm going to do is give you some insights that have been gleaned from what's approaching a decade of atmospheric carbon measurements in the Alaska and northwestern North America area, made by aircraft, satellites, and by ground-based instruments, and use that towards the discussion that we're starting about observing systems for Pan-Arctic carbon budget. I just wanted to kind of do a recap of what Emily showed a little bit earlier with a slightly different tilt, in that if one is thinking about our current gaps in terms of the Pan-Arctic carbon budget, here's a kind of systems engineering look at this. And there's something called a tiered observing and analysis system that's been discussed at a couple of larger meetings that I've participated in over the last year or two. And the idea here is it's not just observations, but we really do need to have something that has a tailored analysis system on the back end, as was shown kind of in the cyclic graph that Emily presented earlier. Tailored obviously to the unique challenges and conditions of the Arctic, linking together ground-based, airborne and ocean campaigns, and satellite monitoring to kind of get at the observational data aspect of things. But also then we need a comprehensive Arctic system modeling framework that can ingest these data and be challenged by them. So it's not just a modeling framework that acts in isolation, but it's actually being advanced and moving forward with the information from the observations. And it really does need to not only look backwards and give us diagnostic information about what we've seen in the past, but it also needs to use this information to improve forecasts into the future. And we should be able to actually, by using observations, begin to reduce the very large uncertainties that we have in forecasts, not only of the Arctic system, but especially in carbon dynamics in the Arctic. And then we can talk about filling critical observation gaps. One of the things that's obvious, I think, to everyone that's participating in this conversation is that not only do we have geographic and temporal gaps, but to really fill this, we're going to need to move to a Pan-Arctic observing system philosophy. And that will necessarily require integrating together smaller regional networks like the JR station network that the Japanese have in Western Siberia, what's being done in Scandinavia, and integrating campaigns that are more regional in basis too, like the MAM campaign that was run by John Pyle and Ewan Nesbitt in Scandinavia, what we did with CARV and are doing with Above in North America, and for instance, Yak Arasib that the Europeans have run over Siberia. So the idea is to continue existing time series and start new time series in key observations and locations. All right, with that, I just want to then run through some things that we've put out based on the CARV project and what we're starting to look at with Above to help seed this discussion a little bit further. Key idea here is that just because the snow falls and the surface begins to freeze in the early cold season doesn't mean that we should pack up and stop making carbon cycle measurements. And in fact, this paper from Donatella Zona that was in PNAS a couple of years ago now, and actually here's the cover photo from what the Flux tower looks like in the deep cold season, shows that more than 50% of the North Slope methane emissions were occurring during this cold season period. And so if you stop making your observations at the end of the growing season and assume you've captured everything, you are in gross error. And in fact, this is something that's been known and rediscovered periodically for at least the last 30 to 40 years. And we're just highlighting it again here. One of the key things, again, about this is what the surface looks like. This is a photograph I took from the CARV plane on the North Slope in October of 2015. And you wouldn't think there's any activity, but the activity is actually being driven not by what's happening up at the surface, but the fact that there's still a persistent thawed layer that exists below the surface. And as long as there is basically one molecule of liquid water available, you will continue to see metabolism. It's well known that there is a freezing point depression that's taking place in Arctic soils. And so 0 degrees is also not the threshold. You can have liquid water down significantly below 0, even down to say 2 or 3 degrees in some key areas. And it's known that the microbes that are living in these environments can metabolize reasonably well down as cold as -10 C. So what we're looking at is this freezing front and how long this persists, this so-called zero curtain period, when the temperatures are around 0. This is a comparison from Dona's paper where the lines and the shading give you the mean and the relative ranges of the fluxes from a set of towers on the North Slope. The individual symbols here show days where we flew the carved plane over the North Slope and were able to make estimates of the fluxes. You can see that at the tail end of the growing season, beginning around the 1st of September, the fluxes do not go down to 0, but in fact tail off much more slowly. And this is following the 0 curtain period. And even though the flux towers themselves have fetches or representativeness of something that's like a few hundred meters around the tower, and the aircraft measurements have representation scales of order hundreds of kilometers, that they actually are very consistent. And so we are getting a reasonably good representation of the North Slope from the few flux towers that are operating year-round there. Again, to emphasize this 0 curtain period, the bottom plot shows a time series plot of soil over a couple of years. And you can see that beginning in early September, the temperatures of the soil are beginning to hover right around 0, and it's not until late November or early December that they actually drop significantly below 0. This latency is due to the heat of formation of ice. So there's an extra energetic barrier that needs to be surmounted before all the liquid water freezes. This is a well-known kind of high school experiment that many of you might have done with ice cubes and liquid water in a styrofoam cup, where you measure to see until all of the ice is melted. You don't get a large temperature change. While we're seeing this 0 curtain period, you can see that the fluxes are still significantly non-zero and accumulating up. And in fact, with the change that we're seeing in the northern high latitudes, this 0 curtain period is now as long or perhaps even longer than the traditional thawed season, during which people are making measurements, kind of highlighted over here in these peak areas. So this is observed also for carbon dioxide and respiration. And in a paper that came out, just this spring with Roisin Comain as the lead author, we looked at several years of budgets for Alaska. And you can see that even in a year where there's significant net uptake of carbon dioxide by Alaskan ecosystems, it's still counterbalanced by the fossil fuel emissions. And in 2 of the 3 years, we had significant net emissions before taking into account fire or the fossil fuel emissions. Looking at the longer term time series from Barrow, unlike methane situation where we don't see any long-term trend in the overall emissions from Barrow, here we see a definite increase in carbon dioxide over time. Linking that in with our estimates of the Alaskan carbon budget for the last several years suggests that sometime during the 1980s or 1990s, that Alaska transitioned from being a net carbon sink to being a net carbon source, and that we are on a trajectory moving forward into the near term where that source is going to increase over time. It's a very interesting question about whether this applies to the rest of North America and even to the rest of the Pan-Arctic. And there are some other studies that Dave and others can tell us about that address that. There's also a wonderful paper that combines looking at solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence with remote sensing. Here's an image from the GOME satellite combined over 2014 and 15, put together by Nick Perezu. Here's what the OCO data look like in their strips with not complete spatial sampling, but very, very high density for the same period. And by driving the polar VPRM model with SIF rather than EVI, so here the black line is the model driven by by EVI, And then as you go to either the green or dashed lines, you can see that there's a significant difference in the beginning of the spring uptake period, also in the beginning of the fall return or zero crossing period. And we found that, that these SIF-driven PVRM models are agreeing much better with the estimates of the flux temporal distribution that we get from both the flux towers and from the inversions that are done using the atmospheric data from CARV and flux towers. Then Nick did a very nice job of looking at what kind of a strategy would one need to detect the permafrost carbon feedback. And it's kind of shown here in these two little maps. You don't see very much of a gradient across Alaska during the June to August growing season. And so you might be able to get by with one or two sampling sites. But as you move into the early cold season, September to December timeframe, you notice that there's actually quite a significant difference in where we have either residual uptake that's still seen, or we see the beginning of some pretty significant emissions. And so in this study, doing a kind of system observing test or an AOSST, it seemed like the minimum number of sites that would be needed to capture this kind of gradient in the early cold season is about 6, kind of positioned here near some of the sites where logistics would permit monthly aircraft flights, for example. Above is performing a different version of this experiment with flights in the April to October period, and it's using one aircraft, but it's acquiring profiles at 11 different sites across Alaska. So most of these sites, including a couple of others out here on the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue, Dead Horse and Tulik, instead of Ivatuk, in addition to Ivatuk, sorry, also at Umiat, and then Galena in the interior. So a few more sites, and we're going to be very interested to see how much that improves our knowledge. But again, if you're just going to look in the summer, you're likely to miss a large-scale onset from something like the permafrost carbon feedback. So that's the set of slides that I had, and I'm very much looking forward to the rest of the discussion. So I will free up the screen for the next presenter.
Great, thank you so much, Chip. All right, so we will move on to the next talk, which is Eugenie. Are you all ready, Eugenie? You were muted, but I just unmuted you.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. There we go. I see you now. All right, we can see your slides.
Okay. Okay, so I'm here to talk about 3 different things, actually. First is the AON project that we've had going on in Alaska and Siberia from 2007 until present. And then I also want to say a few words about the next generation ecosystem experiment that's been going on in Barrow and starting up in the Seward Peninsula the last couple of years, starting in Barrow about 6 years ago. It's a DOE funded project. And then I also want to say a few words about ongoing and carbon flux synthesis and what we're doing for that in the future. So starting off in terms of this AON project, this is a project that began during the International Polar Year. It was funded in 2007, and it's been a collaborative effort between several different institutions, including the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the Marine Biological Laboratory, and the University of Michigan, as well as the Northeast Science Station in Northeast Siberia Science Station, Field Station in Siberia near Cherski. And so what we've been doing in this project is a number of different goals that we've had have been to, first of all, collect year-round continuous observations of carbon, water, and energy fluxes in Arctic, both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. And then think about integrating these data across different timescales and thinking about the processes that control the fluxes, the short term versus long term, and also various rates of change. And then we've also been not only just collecting our own data, but incorporating data from past studies and ongoing studies near our sites, which can help to interpret this change. And so this includes collaborating with other ongoing AON projects and other NSF-funded projects, and also things like CARV and the NGEE project as well. And so we've produced quite a lot of data with this project. I think we've got a large database of carbon, water, and energy flux based on eddy covariance observations. We have 4 sites near Obnaviat Creek, Alaska, across the watershed in the Obnaviat watershed. We have a site on Tuluk Lake, and then in Cherski, Siberia, we also have 2 flux towers. We've collected CH4 ebullition fluxes on lakes near Tuluk and Cherski. We've looked at soil, water, stream flow, and their dissolved carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus at Obnaviat Creek. We've looked at, collected a lot of different meteorological variables, and then we have this complementary data from flux tower sites to help enrich our measurements. And this includes data like phenology, looking at species composition, biomass, and MPP. We've gone out and done a lot of field studies that have laboriously plucked the vegetation and then determined the above ground and below ground primary productivity. We've looked at soil carbon and nitrogen stocks. And then we've looked at the spatial variation in the carbon and the methane fluxes. The graph here at the bottom is showing you the relation between the terrestrial carbon flux based on the eddy covariance towers and then the stream carbon export that has been collected at Obnaviat Creek. So what we're trying to do is then put together a whole carbon budget of the Obnaviat watershed based on all these different measurements we've collected. It's probably about the best studied watershed in northern Alaska. So putting together a carbon budget in this watershed is an important thing to do, and actually a tractable problem. And so these are just a few photos of our flux towers. We really did focus on collecting data throughout the winter, starting in 2007. We set the towers up in September of 2007, and they've been running ever since. And we found that the sites are 2 sources. These are the 2 longest running sites. We have a tussock tundra site as well. Initially, we just collected data there from about October, from about March through October, but the heath tundra and the wet sedge tundra, we've collected data continually. And so you can see here that the 2 sites do vary in the amount of CO2 they've released. So a positive value here indicates a loss of CO2 to the atmosphere, with a difference in the wet sedge tundra and the heath tundra, particularly in the most recent years. And a lot of this goes back to, as Chip was talking about earlier, the warming of the soils, particularly during the fall. We've seen a pretty significant amount of warming in the permafrost here. We've collaborated with Vladimir Romanovsky, who has a borehole at this site, and have looked extensively at his borehole data to see how the soils are warming and how this then relates to the CO2 fluxes. And so the idea here is that for each day that the zero curtain period increases, the wet sedge releases 1.34 grams carbon per meter squared, whereas the heath tundra releases 0.65 grams carbon per meter squared for each day that the zero curtain period increases. So the wet sedge is a little more sensitive to these warming soils than the heath tundra. And so this tells us that we actually need to look at across different sites in the tundra, even sites that are very close together, to really understand how these sites are responding to warming temperatures. And then this is over in Siberia, where we have 2 towers. We have this tall 40-meter tower in a ecotonal site that's located at the border between the boreal forest and the Arctic tundra. It's a primarily large site with a lot of shrub cover as well. And then we also have a tower in a site that was actually mechanically disturbed by a bulldozer. All the organic matter was removed by a bulldozer. And so the site has thermokarsted in a very profound way, and there's a lot of pit and mound topography with these very wet areas within the soil. And so we've been collecting measurements at both these sites up until last year. We collected measurements at both these sites. And again, we see this relation between warming soils and release of NEE, so or release of CO2. And so this graph at the bottom here is based on the ecotonal site. So it's interesting because we do see the same sorts of processes that are occurring at both sites, both in Alaska and Siberia. And so that's all I want to say for now about the about the AON project. And I'll move over to the NGEE project, which, as I said earlier, is a large DOE-funded project to look at the coupling between biological, geochemical, and landscape processes. It's been focused on lowland ecosystems around the Barrow Peninsula area, and then more recently it's moved over to the Seward Peninsula, thinking about the upland ecosystems. And so there's a lot of biogeochemistry studies that have occurred in terms of the NGEE project, looking at fluxes of CO2 and methane and their controls based on temperature, soil water, the geochemistry, and microbial processes. A few studies that I just wanted to highlight here, based on chamber-based and eddy covariance measurements in the field, incubation studies, and then there's been some isotopic work done, and also a bit of data synthesis as well. There's one study that came out in Global Change Biology that looked at methane release across the Barrow Peninsula in terms of the high center and the low center polygons. And what was found here was that methane oxidation actually plays an important role in some of these landscape components, but not all of them. And that was highlighted in this Global Change Biology article in 2016. And then the eddy covariance tower that was installed at this area has helped to determine the role of spring pulses of CO2 and methane and how those might be related to the overall carbon budget in this area. And what Nama Ras-Yais found here was that she saw spring pulses of CO2 and methane that seemed to be rather significant when calculating the carbon budget of the area. And then Mark Lara has also worked quite a bit mapping the area in terms of the high, flat, or the low-centered polygonal tundra, and this map here on the bottom left of the slide. And what he found was that there were, as the pit and mound, or as the high center, low flat, high, flat, and low center polygons changed, there were some, the thermokarst pits could strengthen both the CO2 uptake, but also the release of methane as well. And that was also published in Global Change Biology. And so in addition to this large component of biogeochemical measurements in the field, the NGEE project has a big modeling component as well. And some of this modeling component recently has focused on vegetation dynamics, thinking about what types of measurements we need to take in the field of the plants in order to do a better job modeling the plants in biogeochemical models, and how that may be important for accurately modeling the biogeochemistry of the region. And so in this latest phase of the NGEE project in the Seward Peninsula, there's been a big focus on looking at shrubs and quantifying the impact of shrubification on biogeochemistry and Arctic carbon cycling, particularly timely, since a number of studies have shown how much shrubs are changing in their presence across the Arctic tundra landscape, becoming quite a bit more prevalent. And then there's another focus on collecting a lot of different plant trait data and then identifying which plant traits are most important in simulating vegetation dynamics and biogeochemistry in Arctic tundra. So this overall approach here is to fuse model and data together, and then feed the data into the vegetation models. And there's been a big push by the NGEE team to actually take modelers out in the field and make them do the measurements so that they know actually what's going on in the field, and it makes more sense when they're putting their data into the models. And so that is what I want to say about the NGEE project. And then finally, last, I want to mention a little bit about this new effort that has been funded as a workshop with Ted Schur to look at Arctic carbon exchange and synthesizing permafrost zone ecosystem carbon flux data, including both chamber and eddy towers. And this actually links together several groups that have been involved in this, including the NSF, the DOE, and NASA. And it also arises from past efforts. We had a workshop in conjunction with ISOA in Helsinki to start thinking about this just this past February. And then the Permafrost Carbon Network with Ted Schur has also had several efforts to work on these types of syntheses as well. And so some of the goals of this workshop are to reconcile two past data syntheses that have shown slightly different things, and also to bring to completion a non-summer, this includes winter, spring, and fall season flux analysis. That's something that Sue Natali has been working on, and has been putting together a lot of non-summer data towards that people have contributed. And then also thinking about merging contemporary and historic data so carbon dynamics, the permafrost zone can be reported as close to present time as data processing follows. And so this is something that would then be potentially merged into efforts such as NOAA's Arctic report card or other sorts of outlets that like to report this data at a sort of real-time or close to real-time time basis. And then hopefully another goal of this would actually be provide a framework to continually add to this carbon flux data as they're collected in the field and become available. And so we've identified a number of participants, and we're going to start planning the workshop in the fall and hope to have a workshop in March at NCEE's in Santa Barbara, and then a second workshop also at NCEE's in October with the release of the product in December of 2018. And so those are all the slides I have.
Great, thank you so much, Eugenie. I will definitely circulate information about that workshop. I think there's a lot of people that would be interested in knowing that that's going on. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to move on to our last speaker, which is Dave McGuire. Dave, are you ready?
I'm ready, but Eugenie, have you unshared?
Unshared. Let's see. Stop share. Yes.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Yep. Yeah. So let me move. Out of the way here. Yeah. So what I want to talk about is the search, which is the study of environmental Arctic change. Its effort to reconcile northern permafrost region methane budgets. And just a little background on search role in this effort. Search is currently supporting three teams: a sea ice action team, a land ice action team, and a permafrost action team. And the permafrost action team this effort comes under the purview of the permafrost action team. And there's actually three sort of sub activities of the permafrost action team. One is the permafrost carbon network shown on the left, but there's also an activity focused on infrastructure and fish and wildlife. So it's the permafrost carbon network that is organizing this effort within the permafrost action team within search. So just a little background on the permafrost carbon network. Its objective is to produce knowledge through research synthesis that can be used to quantify the role of permafrost carbon in driving climate change. Its activities are to organize a sequence of meetings and working groups to synthesize existing carbon research in the permafrost region. And it's formed a consortium of interconnected researchers to disseminate synthesis results. It has a website, and another activity is to enhance young researcher networks. Okay. So a little bit of background on the methane synthesis effort. So the AMAP Arctic Carbon Assessment, which I led back in the late 2000s, noted a discrepancy in methane emissions for the permafrost region between bottom-up scaling and top-down estimates. And then more recent assessments, reports, and studies haven't really reduced this discrepancy, and it's still considered a discrepancy by the scientific community. So the methane synthesis activity or effort being organized by SEARCH is to conduct syntheses that help resolve the discrepancy between the bottom-up and top-down estimates. And the challenge is that the overall activity needs to be a joint effort that harmonizes perspectives among the atmospheric, the coastal, and the onshore perspectives. And the onshore are primarily wetlands and inland waters like lakes. So the progress to date in organizing the effort has been there was a 2-hour scoping workshop that was held at the Permafrost Carbon Network annual meeting in December 2015, and that led to the need to organize a workshop, and so we did organize that workshop, and that was held in Seattle last March to bring these communities together to develop a plan that would make progress towards resolving this discrepancy. So the objectives were to develop this plan and to communicate the state of the science among the communities that are conducting top-down and bottom-up methane budget approaches, and to communicate the synthesis plans that these 3 communities have currently, and to identify key connections to the sea ice and the land ice activities of SEARCH, and to refine synthesis plans based on the workshop discussions. And the second major objective was to develop a plan for communicating results of the workshop to stakeholders. So the workshop was supported by 4 agencies: NSF, NASA, USGS, and the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. 42 scientists that attended the workshop, and included representations of the atmospheric, the inland, and the marine and the remote sensing communities. 11 of the participants were early career scientists, and 9 of the scientists were for institutions outside the United States. So the products that have been produced by the workshop have been a plan for producing an integrated synthesis, a plan for communicating results of the synthesis, and a meeting report in EOS, and that was just published within the last 2 weeks, and I've provided the link to the meeting report. Okay, so just the integrated synthesis plan basically has 3 different components. There's a near-term priority to develop a roadmap, and that's the idea is to complete that by the end of this year, and that is underway in a couple of different efforts. One is an EOS project update, and another as a sort of a potentially an opinion piece for Nature that is underway. And then there's a near-term there are 5 near-term priority activities identified based on data synthesis and analysis. And I'll show those in subsequent slides. And then there's longer-term priority activities that focus on evaluation of uncertainties and spatial and temporal scaling approaches. And those are kind of on the 3 to 5 year time frame. And for anyone interested in seeing the full plan, it's available at, on the link that I've provided. So just to quickly go over what the near-term activities are. One is to compile existing atmospheric observations in the northern permafrost region and summarize what the compilation says about the dynamics of methane in the region during the past several decades. Another is something that both Chip and Eugenie hit upon, the need to synthesize cold season methane emissions from lakes and wetlands, and also the use of multiple transport models to better constrain estimates of cold season methane emissions. A third is the synthesis of lake ebullition data. And a fourth is the creation of a methane-centric land cover database and the development of a state-of-the-art land cover model to assess the magnitude and spatial distribution of methane emissions through the assimilation of information on characteristic methane flux magnitudes and controls for each land cover class. And the last is the development of a paper that reviews the spatial and temporal variations of methane emissions among the shelves of the Arctic Ocean and its marginal seas to identify the uncertainties associated with the extrapolation of you know, what are recognized as sparse observations from the shelves. So these are all ongoing, and the idea is that they'll produce papers that are submitted in the 2018 timeframe. The longer term activities, there's 3 of them. One's an analysis of the sensitivity of different scaling approaches for estimating wetland methane emissions in the northern permafrost region. Another is a comparison of methane scaling methodologies for the North Slope of Alaska. And the third is to generate synthetic time series at existing and hypothetical measurement sites to determine what trends are recoverable for particular observation strategies. And this is probably what's most relevant to this group in terms of determining how to expand on the current observation network. The one thing I would want to mention is that the workshop also identified the role of remote sensing in the effort, and what could be done. The first bullet here is what can be done on currently available data, and some new sensors that may be able to contribute to that. The second is the Merlin instrument, which will be launched in 2021, should provide information in the cold and dark season, but it will be limited because it has a narrow sampling swath. And the longer-term synthesis activities will also make expanded use of year-round atmospheric vertical profiling that's designed to cover gaps in the remote sensing surveys due to low light conditions and cloud cover. So the workshop also developed a communication and management plan. The initial outreach product from the workshop was this meeting report that's just been published in EOS. The second is to construct knowledge pyramids to convey the state of our science to knowledge makers, to policymakers. And so the search knowledge pyramid is the idea is that syntheses build on papers that are produced by individual groups and projects. The activities that I've just presented fall into this the second tier from the bottom, these syntheses. But the communication plan actually deals with these top two tiers here, the briefs and the summaries. And so the permafrost action team will be responsible for helping to produce these to more that are able to inform society in general, as well as policymakers. And finally, yeah, that's what I just mentioned. For the third bullet is the permafrost action team. So the permafrost action team will manage and track the progress of the overall synthesis effort, and will take the lead in developing these research summaries and briefs that I just talked about. And that is all I have for the presentation right now. So